Good morning. The reading taken today that Rob has chosen is from the book of Job, chapter 1, verses 6 through 12. Subtitle is Satan Allowed to Test Job. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, who fears God and turns away from evil?" Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "Does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed him for the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has in your hand, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. Amen.
Welcome. A good morning to everyone. Last week, we were taking a look at the book of Ecclesiastes, and I know that some of you have read it, and I hope you gathered some hope from that. The idea being that there is hope and there is comfort found in the Bible. And as a quick review of Ecclesiastes, Koheleth, or Solomon, says that if you are out there rushing around trying to grab everything and you think you're going to find happiness out there, it's not to be found in the world. So don't bother all this pursuit and this greed and neglecting the important things of life. You've got what you have in your hand. Be content with that. Be content with what you have. Be content with your relationships with other people. But most of all, be content with your relationship with God. And stick with God and have your faith and your trust in him. That's where the true hope is to be found, not out in the world. And I had Diane put this up. This is an idea of the seasons of life. Koheleth talks about the seasons. He says that good times come, good times go. We go through the different seasons. We have our spring and our summer. Everything is great. But then fall comes, and then you're plunged into winter. And we all know how long winter lasts, but it does end. And so even when tough times come, and God has made life to be crooked, he didn't make it to be straight, you can find comfort in knowing that spring is coming. And I just had Diane to put this up just to show you this is what was believed during the Middle Ages. It's called the Wheel of Fortune, or the rota, sometimes wheel, rota, rotary. And on this particular wheel, you'll see a duke, and he's on the rise. He becomes king, then he falls from grace, and then at the end, he's dead below the wheel. And people see these. They're very common motif in the Middle Ages. It actually goes back to Rome. Some of them look like Ferris wheels. You'll see the Lord and the Lady, and oftentimes they're being tipped unceremoniously into some mud at the end. Other times you'll see a person, he's hanging on upside down at the bottom of the wheel, with his arms wrapped around the wheel, his legs wrapped around the wheel, because he knows it's going to go up again. And I would suggest that an idea like this, mentioned by Solomon in Ecclesiastes, how we were going through these seasons, is probably more realistic than our own idea, which we believe in the moonshot. You set off and your life is going to be on a trajectory and it's going to go nowhere but up. And occasionally maybe, oh yeah, there's a little bit of turbulence, or there's some bumps in the road, we might say it. But if you look at reality, we do have these seasons that we go through. So we can take heart in that. Now, this morning's reading, or this lesson, is about Job. And where I left off last week, I said I was going to pick up this week with one specific example of one individual. And Job has got to be one of the most well-known characters that we have, not just within our own world, but even in the ancient world. Job was famous, And I know in the 19th century, there were individual skeptics who tried to say, oh, Job is just a fictional character. He was never. But now we know that there was a man named Job. We find it in the cuneiform. We even find Bildad, one of his friends, in cuneiforms. And what's unusual about Job is not that he runs into tough times, hard times. He does. He has people from Sheba come up and they walk off with his flocks, and then he has Chaldeans, and then he has his family killed. But it all happened in one compressed moment of time. So he has these series of catastrophes. And we know life is tough. We know that trials come. We have hardship, we have pain, but it all comes at one time. And even within the book of Job, he mentions to his friends, everybody is talking about me. He has become famous, but in the wrong way. He's notorious for all this bad luck, and they're laughing at Job. So what can we learn from Job and from the trials which he endured? Well, he's a righteous man. He's a blameless man. He's rich. He has a family. He's well respected. And the Job we know from history was either a chieftain or a prince, depending on our definition of what that would be. And it's all wiped out. Everything is taken from him except from his wife. And that may not be a good thing because she challenges him. And we will see that. But I think that if we just take a look at the first 2 chapters, and I don't want to neglect the rest of the book, it's all important. And it talks and answers questions about God and the nature of evil. But we're going to concentrate on the trials. These first 2 chapters are actually quite stunning, the lessons we can learn from these. And it's very instructive. And as we've seen, there's this attack on Job's character. And then Satan comes out and these various things happen to him. He loses his sheep, his camels, there's raids. His sons and daughters are killed in the tornado. And in verse 20, after these things have all happened and Job hears the news one after the other, Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell on the ground and worshiped. Now we can understand in the ancient times, you know, if you tear your robe, that's showing grief, and you shave your head, he's mourning, but he worshiped. How unusual. And is that your first impression? Is that what you would do when all of a sudden calamity comes upon you? The first lesson we can learn here is that in times of trials, we should be worshiping God more, not less. Now, we had the lesson which kicked us off a little bit about Jesus and the storms of life. And the disciples that were in the boat with Jesus, they did worship Jesus, but they didn't worship him during the middle of the storm. They were terrified. It was only after everything was settled down and everything had calmed down. But here we see Job at the very beginning of his trials, and he doesn't know how long this is going to last. He doesn't know where he's going. Everything is gone. It's not like he has a few animals and he can breed them again, and his seed capital is all gone. But still, he worships God. And I think this is a powerful example for us. We have to resist the temptation to pull away from God. Now, we tend to think that when things go wrong, we need time. We'll withdraw on our own. We'll find some distractions, watch a movie or a book or whatever. But no, he turns to God. Now, even if we flip back and took a look in history at the children of Israel, what do they do when they're in the wilderness? Rather than worship God, Moses is up on the mountain. They build themselves an idol. They're singing, they're dancing, they're drinking, they're carousing. And they added 40 years onto their time in the wilderness because of that. Better example would have been taken from Job. So he falls down and he worships. So trials, when we have them, must push us to draw closer to God, to seek God out, be right there with him. And we can at least give it to the disciples. They didn't jump out of the boat. That would have been foolish. They would have drowned. They did go to Jesus. Now their faith was being tested and they didn't know that he could save them, but they at least didn't jump out of the boat. And we have to draw closer to God, just as Job drew closer to God. But the second point that we can learn from this is found in verse 21. And this is why Job is able to worship God, because he has a different perspective than we have. Sadly, our perspective is wrong. Naked I came from my mother's womb. Naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And it goes on to say, in all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing. So what is his perspective here? Job understands that we start with nothing. We come into this world, we can't talk, we can barely see. If we can, we don't have clothes, we're helpless. And at the end of life, well, that's it. Nobody can help you. You're gone. Job's perspective is everything in between, everything in that dash between your birth date and your death date, everything in between is a gift from God. God gives us so many blessings, and God has given Job these blessings. Everything in the middle is from God. And so we should take what he gives, we should accept what he takes away. And this is very important to remember. Now, what about us? Our society is so messed up. We are messed up because we've been raised in this society. So just come along with me as I explain this. Probably this happens when you're about in high school, and you think about it. All kids in high school, no matter where they're at, they have these certain ideas. How we get them in our head, maybe it's the teachers, maybe it's the parents, TV, movies, whatever. But we start to plan that trajectory, and we're going to go nowhere but up. What school are we going to go to, or what career are we going to get? Oh, and think of the salary I'm going to get, and maybe I'll find the person of my dreams. Yes, I'm going to do that, and I'm going to get the job I want. I'm going to go vacations, and you fill in the blank wherever you want to go. And this is what we think right from the time we're in high school. And you can probably look back when you were in high school and you'll laugh now and you'll snicker at what you thought. Reminds me of the old riddle. How do you make God laugh? Well, you tell him your plans, because they're not going to work out. And of course, by the time we get to 80 or 85, that's how long we're going to live. We'll be able to see our children and our grandchildren, and maybe they NHL players or Nobel Prize winners. And this is how we think. And you know that I'm telling you that this is right. And our vision is false. Does God really owe us any of this? Well, in our minds, we think that God owes us this, or if you don't believe in God, well, life owes me this, or the universe will give me this. And this is pressed on us all the time. How many times have you heard somebody say, I deserve this, or I deserve better? Or you hear these advertisers, they tell us, you deserve the best, you deserve this. And it is constantly bombarding us. And we forget that what we have is undeserved blessing from God. Because really, what does God owe us? Does he owe us a long life? Does he owe us good health? Does he owe us the job of our satisfaction, or a marriage, a happy marriage, healthy children? Really, what does he owe us? Job says, well, he owes us nothing. We started out with nothing, we end with nothing. So, he really doesn't owe us anything. And if we apply it to our own lives, and just think with me, only you fill in your own blanks. I've been around 60 years and I've had relatively good health. Did God owe that to me? I know people I went to school with, they haven't lived this long. They haven't had the health that I had. My wife's health has not been as good. She was diagnosed with cancer. They gave her 3 to 5 years to live. 10 years later, she's still around. That's a blessing. Every year beyond that, every of those 60 years that I've had has been a blessing. If I die tomorrow, drop dead tomorrow, hey, that's fine with me, because I've been blessed up until now. The house we live in, we've lived there for 20 years. If it burns down tomorrow, well, I've had 20 years without the rain and without being frozen with the wind and with the snow. So this is what Job is saying. And this is why he can worship God. Now, it's not that he doesn't feel the pain. Obviously, he does feel this pain. But he has a different perspective than what we have. Now, in the middle of the book, with his friends talking to him, he does get a little bit sucked into this. And, I wish I could argue with God. And I would show him that I'm a good man. But that's only for a little while. Now, in chapter 2, then he's afflicted. If it's not enough that he's had these tragedies come upon him, now all of a sudden he gets some kind of disease, and we don't know what it is. People argue about it today. Is it elephantiasis or leprosy or what kind of boils or whatnot? And he's really hit badly here. And then his wife says in verse 9, do you still persist in your integrity? Curse God and die. So she's tempting him, just forget God. He's forgotten you. But verse 10, Job replies, you speak as any foolish woman would speak. Shall we receive the good at the hand of God and not receive the bad? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. I don't know if you call winter bad. I mean, I hear people complaining more in the winter than I do in the summer, and it seems to last a long time, and some winters are worse than the others. But we realize that we get good weather, we get what we might call bad weather, and things like this happen in life. We receive what we call good and receive what we would call bad. And in the long run, in the great perspective, they may not necessarily be bad. If you ask those disciples in the boat with Jesus, I'm sure they said that storm was bad. That was terrible. They were terrified. They were almost going to drown, but they didn't. So this perspective gives Job hope, and it will give us hope as well. Don't concentrate, what have I lost? Job doesn't say, what have I lost? But look at what you have. So that's the second lesson we can learn. We started with nothing. We're going to end with nothing. So everything in the middle is a blessing. But sometimes, point number 3, and this is the most, this is one that we do not like at all. This is very unpleasant. Sometimes we need to be jarred from our comfort zones. When you look at it, we don't learn from the good times. I wish we could say, oh yeah, good times, you learn all kinds of lessons, but we learn from our mistakes. If you do something successfully the first time around, you might not learn a lot from it, but it's those mistakes, it's those bruises, it's those cuts, those falls, and we learn from them. And James echoes this, and he says it in his little book, his little epistle, count it all joy when you run into trials. He says that, and we've read that, but do we count it joy? I don't think we, hey, great, a trial is coming upon us. We don't do that. They are unpleasant. Now, Elihu, later on in the book, Job 33, and he's a candidate for perhaps writing this because he was there and heard the conversations. He told Job, unlike the other 3 friends, that God uses trials to turn us back, to enlighten us. So he's saying that trials are teaching tools. And actually, when we think about it, that's true. You've probably learned a lot more from trials and from mistakes than from the good times. And we don't like it. It's unpleasant. But God does teach us through the trials. And there's no better school, really, than the school of hard knocks. And we know that. Sometimes trials take a long time. We'd like to just take the lesson, 30-minute lesson one day, and that's fine. I'm done with the trial. But it takes time. It took the children of Israel 40 years. Imagine that, 40 years in the wilderness. But trials do transform us. Ultimately, Job is transformed, and through him, his friends as well, who've been there with him. They're necessary, and we don't want it, and it's unpleasant, and it's painful, but we need them. And God uses trials, and it hurts us, and it's challenging, but there's no better teacher for us. Why do we endure these trials? Well, this is why I had Dan read 6-12. And I don't know if you've ever considered this before, but we endure them for a very deep meaning indeed. And we see a meeting here between the Lord and Satan. And critics have said, this is impossible. Why is it impossible? When you're in school, you don't realize teachers and principals get together, and at your place of work, you've got the higher ups, the executives, and they are meeting and they're getting together and they're planning for the running of this country. Yes, we have the House of Parliament, but there's the various caucus meetings, in-camera sessions. We don't know about those. Those are going on. So why should it surprise us that God and whoever on a cosmic plane, a different level than us, they are getting together, having meetings? And so here Job is raised. And this is really the setup for the entire book. And although it's called the book of Job, it's not really about Job. Job just happens to be the unwitting participant or the guinea pig in this, because this is a test. And we see the setup right here. And Satan really is saying you know, you look at these humans, God, you made these creatures, these weak little creatures, and they're not serving you because you are great, because you are grand, because you are the creator, because you're wonderful, which he is. They are just serving you for the stuff you give them. We're just mercenary individuals. And yes, Job, he's a good man, but he's only doing it because look at what he's done. You put a hedge around him or a fence around him, and you've protected him, and you've blessed his crops, and you've given him kids. You take him away, and he's not going to worship you. So this is the true meaning of the book. The question really is, why do we serve God? Do we serve him because he is great, or we serve him for the stuff, for what he gives us? If there is no earthly benefit, will you continue to worship God? And so let's just test this out. And this is the big point, the very big point. And Job comes through, and he does it. He doesn't sin. He doesn't charge God with wrongdoing. And so there's another meeting with God and with Satan. And God says, you know, I told you, Satan, you know, he's a good man. This is the way these good humans can be. They will worship me, and it's not for the stuff. You had your little test. You took everything away. And this is when even more evil or an even more difficult trial is going to come upon him. Satan answers the Lord, skin for skin. All that people have, they will give to save their lives. But stretch out their hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. The Lord said to Satan, very well, he's in your power, only spare his life. And I'm sure that Job probably would have preferred to just been killed right there and then join his kids. But he endures this terrible affliction. Loathsome sores on Job from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. How awful is that? Yeah, he could withstand losing everything, but now his very body is in pain, racked with pain. His health is afflicted terribly. And this is something that we, even in our modern age, with all our medical advances in technology, dread and fear. And it comes upon him. And that's when his wife comes to him. And Job has a really tough time with this. He curses the day he's born. His friends come and try and tell him, well, you must have been doing something wrong, Job. But he hangs in and he slips almost, but he's still holding on to God. He doesn't want to abandon God. And this is what we have to remember. We're not in it for the stuff. We're not in it for our health. Eventually we're going to die and we will join God. And it's tough. And it is really tough on poor Job here. And sometimes it's tough on us. We all have our individual afflictions. We're all going through health problems. We will. That's part of life. That's reality. And when you're in high school, when your trajectory is off to the moon, you don't think about what's going to happen. Now you're going to be one of those happy old people smiling at the end. Doesn't often end that way. Well, how does this give us hope? Well, we have a great believer, or a great belief, and a great redeemer, and that is God. And through the book, Job eventually does come to that conclusion. He says, I know that my Redeemer lives. He will help me. He will be with me. And he's going to cling to that. He's not going to jump out of the boat into the sea as the storm is raging. And he persists, and his fame spreads throughout the ancient world. And we see even in Ezekiel, they're talking about Job and how he hangs in. Unbelievable odds, but he hangs in. And he was a mere mortal like you and I. We can hang in as well. In James 5, starting in verse 7, James has been talking about suffering all along. And his conclusion, be patient, therefore, beloved, until the coming of the Lord. The farmer waits for the precious crop from the earth, being patient with it until it receives the early and the late rains. So again, that wheel that we saw earlier on, the seasons are coming around. Eventually that crop, you've got these dead seeds and you're planting it in cold ground, but eventually the ground is going to warm up. Those seeds are going to spring up. The harvest will come. He says, hang in, persevere. And then he says, Look at the prophets. They spoke in the name of the Lord. People wouldn't listen to them, but now maybe we're listening to them. They were persecuted. Perhaps they were killed. And then he says in verse 11, indeed, we call blessed those who showed endurance, those prophets. And then he says, you have heard of the endurance of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. Now, initially, I might look at that and say, oh, was God compassionate and merciful to Job? He allowed Satan to afflict him. Where's that compassion? Well, the compassion goes back to that transformation, that training of Job. And the mercy, God was with Job every step of the way, every chapter of the book. Might not seem like it, or may not have seemed like it to Job at the time, but for us, looking back, we can see it. And for Job, eventually he's going to look back and he's going to see it. And for yourselves, you take a look at the time when you've been through trials and you've had to hang on your hope to God and you're wondering if you're going to do it. You can look back and you can say, yes, God was with me. At the end of our lives, James is saying, you're going to look back when you are reaping the crop. You're going to look back at those tough times and you're going to remember it, that God was compassionate. He was merciful. He was with me. 2 Peter 2:9. Peter says, the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials. And sometimes the rescue comes in a remarkable way. And you've seen it. It's amazing when all of a sudden it seems to turn for you. Another turn of the wheel. And now spring is there. You wake up that one day and the snow is gone and you can see a little bit of green. The Lord knows how to carry you through today, just as he did back then. Now I'd like to close off with some early Christians, the book of Hebrews, who are really going through a tough time. They're being persecuted. Some of them are being thrown in jail. Some of them are being abused terribly. They've lost their friends. They've lost maybe relations because they won't have anything to do with them. And the writer of Hebrews is trying to encourage them to persevere. And I'm going to take a look at verse 32 to the end of this chapter. Recall earlier days when, after you had been enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to abuse and persecution, sometimes being partners with those so treated. So you might not have faced it, but somebody you love was abused, and that's going to make you just as angry and upset. For you had compassion for those who were in prison, and you cheerfully accepted the plundering of your possessions, knowing that you yourselves possess something better and more lasting. So we talked about last week, pursuing the wind, things that are out there, but they're really not that important. Hanging on to God, having faith in him, having that belief and that hope is more lasting. Do not therefore abandon that confidence of yours. It brings a great reward. For you need endurance, so that when you've done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. For yet in a very little while, the one who is coming will come and will not delay. But my righteous one will live by faith. My soul takes no pleasure in anyone who shrinks back. And then he concludes, and this is us. This is not just these people in Hebrews. We are not among those who shrink back and so are lost, but among those who have faith and so are saved. That's us. We're going to hang in. We have hope. We will be saved. No matter how tough times get for us right now, and they can get tough. Not as tough as Job yet, not as tough as these people written to in the book of Hebrews, but we can hang in. We can endure. So to sum it all up, first point, do not fade back when you are going through troubles and trials. Second point, everyone starts with nothing. Everyone ends with nothing. We have this idea, the guy who dies with the most toys wins. Wrong. You still die with nothing. The middle is a gift from God. Accept the good and the bad. Accept these seasons that we're going to have. And finally, probably the most profound, is that every trial reveals if we are serving God, because of who he is, if we're serving him for nothing, or if we're only serving him for the blessings. And that's a problem that I have with the prosperity gospel. Oh yeah, believe God, follow God, and he'll give you everything. No, he didn't promise that. So don't give up on God. Hang in during those trials, those temptations, the hardships. Press into God. And if you throw your burden upon the Lord, he will carry it for you. He will get you through, and in amazing ways. And that is the lesson for the day. I think next time, perhaps, because of sickness and illness, I want to look at that. And we don't know a lot about Job, but we know a lot more about the hardships and the trials and the pain and the suffering of the Apostle Paul. So next time, in 2 or 3 weeks, I want to take a look at how Paul endured and what Paul says about enduring when our health goes. Thanks. Let's stand and sing.